When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. We need that last piece of the jigsaw.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
It might be a fingerprint, footwear mark, cell site analysis that can come up with that golden ticket to put that investigation on a different path.
Using the very latest techniques.
Several months or even years later, evidence can remain and still be recovered.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
The forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
If you've been in the scene, it's virtually impossible to clean everything up. Something is going to be there. If we're looking in the right place, we'll find it.
Without the unseen heroes painstakingly going through forensic bits, I might not have got justice for my daughter.
This is the story of the expert witness.
Forensic ornithology refers to the identification of human remains, the analysis of bite marks, and also the age estimation of individuals who are either deceased or living.
The quiet coastal town of Helensburgh in Scotland, a picturesque location and the scene of a sinister crime. Scottish crime reporter Graham Mann followed the story of John and Margaret Gardiner from day one.
They were just an ordinary couple with two grown-up children who've moved away from the family home.
In early October, Margaret Gardiner failed to turn up to a family gathering 400 miles away in London. Fearing the worst, her family officially reported her missing. But police began to investigate whether Margaret could have chosen to disappear.
People who knew John and Margaret would have known that there was probably one or two difficulties in the marriage. After John retired from the Navy, he got into some financial difficulties. He had taken out significant amounts of money, thousands of pounds, on credit cards. Margaret was quite vocal in terms of communicating that she wasn't happy in the marriage.
Margaret's work friends offered further insights into the couple's strained relationship.
She confided in colleagues that she had recently discovered that he had taken out a loan of £55,000 and he'd actually forged her signature in order to get access to that money. She wanted him out the house and she wanted to basically end the relationship.
John claimed to have dropped her at the station to catch a train to London. But when police examined CCTV footage, they found no sign of Margaret or John. Investigators were suspicious, and what appeared at first to be a throwaway comment from Margaret took on a chilling significance.
On this particular day, before she left the office, Margaret made a quite disturbing comment to a colleague where she said that if she disappeared, you might want to look in the back garden, suggesting that maybe something sinister could be on the horizon.
Attention turned immediately to the couple's home.
They brought diggers and they started basically digging up the back garden.
But after an extensive search, they found no trace of Margaret. And when forensic teams searched inside the house, it appeared spotless. But then, they made a discovery.
This is when the things start to get a little bit more sinister, where they found a trace of blood under the cold tap in the bathroom, and they found a fragment of a tooth in the waste area underneath the plug hole.
Detectives suspected the tooth fragment belonged to Margaret, but to know for sure, they turned to forensic odontologist Dr. Douglas Sheasby. He faced a tricky challenge.
Generally speaking, dental identifications are based on a large number of teeth. In this case, we had only a fragment of one tooth, approximately 5-6 millimeters in length. The margins of the fragment had not deteriorated in any way, so clearly this was a recent fracture. It wasn't a fragment that had been lying for some time, having been detached an unknown period of time before. This was a recent event. It wasn't possible to identify which tooth, whether it was left, right, upper or lower, but it certainly was the junction between the crown and the root of the tooth. So we were able to confidently locate it within a particular tooth, although at this point we didn't know which tooth.
Nor could Douglas say whose tooth it was. While he continued his analysis, investigations at the house revealed a further disturbing clue. A fragment of bone found in the washing machine. It too was sent for analysis, but John's account was appearing increasingly suspect.
He was claiming that Margaret had left of her own accord, but these body parts, essentially, even though they were minute and small, if they were Margaret's, then John had a hell of a lot of explaining to do.
For Douglas Sheasby, X-rays of the tooth fragment now revealed a vital clue to help prove who it came from.
The X-ray demonstrated, surprisingly, a small fragment of metal. We're looking at the cross-section of a pin, and we know that by virtue of the fact that the shape of the metal fragment is almost circular.
Pins were commonly used in dental reconstruction work in 2004, but the orientation of this particular one was unusual.
Normally, pins run within the length of the tooth, but by virtue of the circular shape, we know that this pin is running through the thickness of the tooth, and that's an important and unusual feature. The distinctiveness of orientation of this metal pin was the basis for a comparison with the victim's dental records.
Douglas searched Margaret's dental records for evidence of a dental pin with the same orientation as the one in the tooth fragment. He found a match.
Again, an almost circular-shaped area of metal, relatively close to the margin of crown and root. The fact that this is a distinctive finding enables you to express a positive identification that this fragment came from the lower left first premolar of Margaret Gardner.
Lab tests of the bone fragment now confirmed it too belonged to Margaret. Detectives presented John Gardner with this evidence and asked if he would like to change his statement. They were astonished by what happened next.
He refuses to say much more about what happened that day unless his daughter Fiona is present. And what we have here is a transcript of the conversation that unfolded when Fiona arrived. So she starts off by simply asking John, "Is Mum dead?" John says, "I've told the police." "Fiona, are you going to tell me?" John, "Yes, she's dead. I didn't murder her, I killed her. It was an accident." Fiona then says, "What happened?" John says, "Mum came home at lunchtime and we had a blazing row. She was making a sandwich and had a knife in her hand. She went for me. I thought she still had the knife. John, I turned her and pushed her and she fell down the stairs, kitchen steps. Fiona, how did you know she was dead?" "She was dead." Fiona then left upset and in tears. It's unfathomable to think that a father, after having killed his wife and his daughter's mother, that he would then compound the offence by putting his daughter through that. It doesn't make any sense, and it tells you everything you need to know about John Gardner.
John was claiming he killed Margaret accidentally. Detectives needed to put that to the test. but they had no body, only the skull fragments found in the washing machine. So they called in forensic pathologist Marjorie Turner.
This piece of bone was from deep inside the skull, deep into where my finger is here. So from my perspective as a forensic pathologist, first thing I'm looking at is what type of injury to the skull and indeed to the scalp must have Margaret had for that bit of bone to come out. There must have been a large area of fracture in this area, and it also must have been fractured into lots of little pieces because we just had a very small broken piece. It's similar to if you tap the top of your boiled egg, the top of the eggshell, and you get fracture lines running, and you get lots of little pieces of eggshell. It's the same, it's lots of little pieces of skull. That pattern of injury is seen in firearms, where someone has been shot in the head, but more commonly in the west of Scotland by blunt force trauma. Multiple blows to the head with some form of blunt instrument.
Marjorie's experience told her that the type of injury needed to allow the bone fragment to come loose wasn't consistent with a fall. Seeking evidence to back up her opinion, she turned to the database of post-mortem cases at Glasgow University.
The database had many thousands of cases of all types. So I could review that looking for, using keywords such as fall, to find deaths where people had fallen and their head had hit the ground or they'd come downstairs, and look at the pattern of injury that was sustained. The database reinforced my initial opinion that a simple fall, such as was proposed onto hard ground, would usually only, if it even caused a fracture to the skull, would usually only cause a simple linear fracture. Therefore, to inflict the injuries that Margaret must have sustained on the basis of that fragment of skull, my opinion, the pattern of injury was much more consistent, and the far most likely explanation was multiple blows with a blunt force weapon.
Marjorie's expert opinion cast severe doubt over John Gardner's version of events. And with Douglas Sheasby identifying the tooth as being Margaret's, police had enough evidence to charge him with murder. In August 2005, his trial was held at the High Court in Paisley.
In the end, he was found guilty of culpable homicide, which means that it was essentially he was responsible for her death, but he didn't mean to kill her. He was sentenced initially to 12 years. He appealed against that, and it was later reduced to 9 years. And the work that was carried out by the forensic experts was absolutely essential to getting a conviction in this case.
John Gardner claimed to have disposed of Margaret's body in a nearby river. But 20 years later, her remains have yet to be recovered.
Tragically, the body has never been found to this day. We're now nearly 20 years on. The only remains that were ever found were the items that they found in the house that day. So, obviously, the fact that they could never lay her to rest, even to this day, is something that leaves a horrible, horrible legacy.
Forensic ecology is about how a crime taken place can pick up environmental trace evidence. And we use this to think about the relationship between a suspect, a scene, and a potential victim.
Thousands of us visit heritage sites across Britain every year. They allow us to learn about the country's rich history and traditions and to appreciate its treasures. But whilst most of us respect these ancient sites, they can be targeted by thieves intending to profit from the sale of stolen artefacts. Mark Harrison, head of Heritage Crime Strategy at Historic England, plays a key role in protecting these sites and combating heritage crime.
People have lived, worked and died in our country for over 800,000 years. They've left a legacy in forms of landscapes, buildings, archaeological sites, shipwrecks. It belongs to all of us. We have a relatively short lifespan. We are the temporary guardians of our heritage, and it falls upon us to make sure that it is preserved, not just for this generation, but for those that follow.
September 2020 in the north of England. A park ranger at a historic estate makes the shocking discovery that valuable York coping stones are missing from the walls that surround the grounds. Police are informed, and Detective Steve Kaminsky and Sergeant Robert Simpson from the Rural Crime Team are quick to respond.
When the job first came in, it's not something that I'd come across before. The actual core crime itself was something I was quite comfortable with, as in theft. However, the impact that that crime had on the heritage site and the long-term implications were something that I really underestimated.
Coping stones are the large flat bricks which sit on top of a wall. Whilst they can be decorative, these durable slabs actually play a vital role protecting the brick and mortar beneath from the elements.
In this case, the thieves took a large number of coping stones. So that wall, if we hadn't identified where it was, would have become very vulnerable to frost and rain and would have become unstable and possibly fallen apart. It was a commodity for them. It was something that they were going to make money from. But for the rest of us, you were stealing our past.
Whilst the historic stones themselves were irreplaceable, the cost of repairing the damage caused was estimated to be more than £30,000. Detectives examined the scene for any evidence that could tell them who might be responsible for the heritage crime.
The difficulties we have in these remote locations is the traditional type of lines of inquiry, such as CCTV, house-to-house, witnesses, and even forensic opportunities are often quite limited. We'd hoped that that would have been a one-off incident and the damage and the cost would be fairly limited. However, as time went on, there were a number of further incidents. At this point, we looked at it and thought perhaps it's the same people and slightly more organised than just a one-off type incident.
Steve and Robert suspected they were dealing with prolific heritage criminals and that they could resurface at any time. Fortunately, an eagle-eyed officer gave them a breakthrough.
An off-duty officer who was on his way into work noticed a flatbed van crawling alongside the Heritage Park boundary wall. Something didn't quite feel right about it, so we did inquiries which identified to us that the vehicle had been hired for a period of time, and it just so happened that that vehicle had been in the area previously around the times when stones had gone missing. And as a result of identifying who had hired it, that then allowed us to work out a person who may be linked to the theft of the stones previously.
Police believed the vehicle was being used to commit further heritage thefts in the area. They now put in place a surveillance operation to catch the criminals red-handed.
So on the final occasion, when the van had attended the Heritage Park and was on its way back out of Cheshire, we got it stopped, and it was at that point the stones were located in the back of the flatbed van.
3 men were taken into custody while the coping stones and the van were recovered to a safe site. Although they'd caught the gang in possession of the stones, during questioning, the suspects denied they were taken from the historic site, with one even claiming they were found in a skip. So for police, the case was far from concluded.
We find ourselves in this really interesting position now. We know it's the stone that's come from there. However, we need to prove it. And we need the help of experts like Historic England that can bring in forensic analysis and do the work that would only be really reserved for murder cases or for really other high-profile cases. We wouldn't normally have that kind of expertise available to us. So to make that jigsaw work, to make those pieces come together, to make it so we can absolutely dot the I's, cross the T's and say, this is the stone that's come from that heritage park, we needed that help.
Historic England put the police team in touch with expert soil analyst Rosie Everett. Could she find the definitive link between the coping stones and the heritage site that police believed they'd been stolen from?
If somebody has taken objects from the surrounding environment, what they will pick up are tiny bits of trace evidence relating to that environment. So what I was employed to do was to examine these coping stones and pull out different environmental trace evidence types to be able to prove that missing link that demonstrated that a crime had been committed. The pressure was on because they need that forensic evidence to make those convictions. The process was twofold. So one was a site visit. So I would take what we call control soil samples from around the wall, mortar samples from the existing wall, and also undertaking a plant and vegetation assessment. So at that point, we had 3 control samples, so soils, vegetation, and mortar from the wall. Then I was taken to the police compound where the vehicle had been seized to examine each of the coping stones. Normally, we'd examine exhibits like that in a laboratory setting, but given they were so heavy, it was myself and a colleague in the police compound trying to turn these stones over, which they weighed a ton. I mean, they were, really long, and so it was quite an unusual process, and we had to adapt our subsampling techniques to suit that process. So you really have to think on your feet with some of this.
Rosie collected samples from the coping stones and brought them back to the lab for further investigation.
What I had was control samples from the protected site and from the coping stones, and then it was basically a matching game. Do they match, and can we demonstrate that these coping stones have been taken from the protected site?
Meanwhile, Detective Steve Kaminsky returned to the heritage site to search for further evidence that could link the suspects to the scene of the crime.
I suspected that there might have been something there due to it being heavy lifting, labour-intensive, moving around. Has something been dropped? And we were fortunate enough that there was a packet of cigarettes sat on the top of a pile of leaves, very close to where the stones had gone missing.
DNA analysis of the cigarette packet revealed one of the 3 suspects was the owner.
Whilst we weren't quite there, it really started to make us think, well, these people have been to that location.
Robert and Steve were gathering evidence against the suspects, but their case would still pivot around whether or not Rosie could forensically link the stones found in the van to the heritage site. She began with the soil samples.
For the soil analysis, we do 2 types of assessment. We do organic components. So are there any microflora or microorganisms that are specific to that site? And then I like to look at the inorganic, so the mineralogy. What is that soil made up of? And is it unique to the site? Or is it unique to the local area or unique to the region? How specific can we get it? The second part of the analysis was to examine the mortar. And the mortar was quite interesting because this site is 17th century, it's why it's protected. And at that time, mortar would have been handmade, specific for this site. So we're able to use that individualization to match between the mortar on the coping stones and the mortar of this protected site.
When Rosie compared both sets of results, she was able finally to give police a definitive answer.
When I took this evidence to the police and to Historic England and said, yes, I think we can demonstrate that these coping stones have come from the protected site, I think that was a big sigh of relief.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. And we needed that last piece of the jigsaw. And I can remember when we were in the office and we had that message. That message came across, it came via email to say, bingo, absolutely, this is a stone that's come from this site, and it was in their van.
We're in a really strong position in terms of the investigation and all the other strands that we already had. This was the final thing that we needed to move it forwards.
Faced with overwhelming evidence, all three men pleaded guilty to stealing historic York stone from the heritage site and causing more than £30,000 worth of damage. They were each given a 2-year sentence, suspended for 18 months, as well as 100 hours of unpaid work and rehabilitation work. The successful convictions made possible by detailed forensic science show how seriously those involved take heritage crime.
So I get asked quite often, why do we investigate heritage crime? But actually the sale of looted goods feeds into systems of other illegal criminal activity. So I don't think people realise the impact that it has on broader society.
I think it's really important that we send this clear message to criminals, and we advertise the fact that we'll go to these kind of lengths working in partnership. And it really does set that kind of precedent, that landmark case of we take it as seriously as any other crime. So if you are going to commit it, there is a real risk that we're going to come straight after you to come and get you.